Dad's going to be proud of you, Aline. You're talking about all this architecture stuff on the podcast.
No, he's still rolling his eyes.
Welcome to the Behavioral Design Podcast. So I recently came across this meme where someone is looking very annoyed and it reads, "Every time my product team discusses a problem with retention, the outcome is always, we're gonna need to add more features." We know that less is often more. We've heard it a million times, but why do we seem to have such a hard time embracing subtracting over adding things? That is something that today's guests of the podcast, Gabe Adams and Lydie Klotz, will help us answer. They've done some recent groundbreaking research on this phenomena published in Nature, and their research on the science of problem solving has identified this fascinating bias against subtraction. In other words, when we solve problems, we tend to favor adding things over subtracting things, even when subtraction offers a better solution. Earlier this year, Lydie released a fantastic book on this research called Subtract: Untapped Science of Less. And that's what we'll be talking about today with Gabe and Lydie. So enough with the preamble. I'm so excited to share this episode with you. Let's get it started.
Heavens to Murgatroyd!
Oh,
So I'm happy to welcome Lydie and Gabe to the Behavioral Design Podcast. Welcome.
Thanks you for having us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Very cool. It's going to be a fun one, I think. We're getting into all things subtract and subtraction and so on. But I wanted to kind of get us off with taking a step back and considering the last 18 months of the experiment we're all been participants in one way or another. And from especially working with behavior change or behavioral science, it's also interesting if there's one takeaway that you've each had from the last 18 months or so in the pandemic. So maybe Gabe, do you want to share if you had any takeaway?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I did not give informed consent to this experiment, this pandemic experiment.
Where was the IRB in all of this?
There was clearly no IRB. I think here, something I've learned, I think, has been about doing research slowly and patiently. And if you can't all of a sudden run experiments at the drop of a hat, what's the most important thing that you want to do? And if you don't have a ton of time, where should you concentrate your time and energy and resources? And, as we're about to get into, I think a lot of that for me has been about applying our research and really subtracting out or editing the things that are distractions from what your true priorities are.
Awesome. And what about you, Lydie?
I agree with that. On a personal level, that's really close to what I would say about my own life. It's just this huge constraint that got put on everything, and just made me think even more about managing my time and how to prioritize the things that are incredibly important. And I would say on a global level, I care a ton about climate change, and in my view, there has to be a huge shift in social norms for us to address climate change in any meaningful way. And so the pandemic was really interesting from that standpoint in terms of, hey, look, people, we can have this massive societal behavior change in a very short period of time. So it was hopeful in that way, but then, not hopeful in terms of we bounced back pretty quickly to kind of our old ways of moving about the world and things. But it did give me hope that these big shifts and people willingly changing their behavior for the benefit of other people on a big scale. So that on a larger level, that's kind of one of my takeaway.
Do you think that any of those big changes, the positive changes, will persist sort of beyond the pandemic?
I think the travel behavior, I find it hard to believe that people are going to go back and just fly to all the same work conferences that they flew to in the past, right? It's
I can't wait to travel.
You're going to be one of these people who does extra traveling to make up for what you missed.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't, but for me, when with that, it's just, I've had better interactions with my collaborators who are not physically located in the same place over these last 18 months because everybody's Zooming. And so again, I can't wait to travel either, but I don't think that all of that will come back. So I'm a little hopeful there, but I don't know. I'm still not super hopeful.
I would like to talk about subtraction. So
Yes.
you've originated this concept of subtraction and really how we're so bad at it. And I want to get a little bit at why we're so bad at it. So, we as humans try and improve things in all sorts of ways. We try and modify them. And the argument that you make is that we can either add or we can subtract. And we're much more inclined to add than we are to subtract. This is because of our biology, our culture, and our morality. But can you tell me a little bit about why this subtraction neglect is so pervasive?
Oh, when Leidy and I first started this research, we had this amazing team of Ben Converse, who's a social psychologist here also at the University of Virginia, and Andy Hales, who was a postdoc at the time, and he's now a faculty member at the University of Mississippi. And we all were getting together and talking about this research. And we were trying to think of instances where people do versus don't subtract and why that might be the case. And in the initial experiments that we conducted, we found that this was just such a robust effect. So the first experiments that we actually conducted were not true experiments. They were actually observational studies. And we just gave people these Lego structures and we asked them to improve them. And that was the sole instruction. We gave it to them on a small card. And just as they were passing by a table, we said, hey, improve this Lego structure. And the vast majority of people who walked past that table and decided to participate in this study improved the Lego structure by adding. And so we were convinced, we were like, this is like such an incredible bias. It's just such a strong bias. At one point we were saying like, this is the biggest bias ever. And obviously, there's nuance to that, but we were struck by just how powerful this is, that when people go in to improve something, that they only think about what they can add and they don't think about what they can subtract. And so to answer your question, why this is so pervasive, we think it comes down to what we see as part of the psychological mechanism that underlies this phenomenon, which is that people don't think about subtracting when they go to improve something. So that's the basic finding in the paper, is that people don't think about what they can subtract when they go to improve something.
It just doesn't even occur to them.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, the Lego study, the first one that we did, I think it was 60 people and one person thought to subtract to make that Lego structure better. But of course, there could be lots of reasons for that, right? They could have thought, oh, maybe I'll take something away. But then they said, I'm not going to like it if I take it away, which in our minds isn't necessarily a problem, right? If you're choosing it, that's fine. But what we found in the paper was that even before this choice, like, oh, do I add or subtract something? You need to think of the option of subtracting. And so some of the later Lego studies, for example, and we did other studies that didn't involve Legos, but we have an affinity for Legos. And some of the later Lego studies, for example, you could subtract to solve the problem by taking one block away, or you could add 8 blocks. And you would get charged for every block that you added, and people would still add, even though taking away was like just obviously the better solution if you thought of it. So, those were the kind of main experiments that we showed in the paper that showed, look, people recognize this is the right thing to do, or the better option. Subtracting is the better option when they think of it, but oftentimes they're just adding and then moving on without even considering subtraction in the first place, which is, a huge contributor to why we might not see it more in the real world.
And how much do you see it as more of a kind of like evolutionary thing that's evolved, or more of a cultural phenomena? It's relation, but if you had to kind of think about those two elements, where do you think it's most influential from?
Go ahead, Gabe. I want to hear your speculation, because my speculation's on record in the book, and I want to hear what you think.
I mean, I'll just parrot actually what Leidy's written in his book, which is to say, I think that it probably comes from, culture and from evolution, and is a learned behavior that is, socially reinforced through, what we're rewarded for. And that happens, as children and in school and in our adult lives as well. So I want to kind of have my cake and eat it too. I think all of those explanations are totally viable. And, what future research could do is start to test those. You can't, of course, experimentally test evolutionary explanations for things, but I could imagine, on the one hand, people may have evolved to kind of want possessions and things that enable their survival. And so might have this bias toward adding rather than subtracting. On the other hand, people needed to be mobile and lightweight and be able to move. And so, there are, I think, competing evolutionary explanations. And, in terms of cultural mechanisms, we know that it's important to, have relational ties to people, that there are interdependent cultures, and that we also think of ourselves and other cultures as independent. And so you can imagine that there's cultural variation in the tendency to add or subtract. Our own research, we have a study in the paper in which we conducted a subtraction task with participants from Germany and Japan and the US. And what you find, or what you'll see in the data, is that there's actually more variation in subtraction within countries and within samples within countries than there is across countries. It's too early to say that this is something that is culturally universal or that is something that differs by cultures. We just don't know yet. We don't have enough data to be able to speculate about that. But it is the kind of thing that makes us think, oh, those would be neat studies to conduct and neat studies to test.
I would add one, I agree with everything Gabe said, obviously. And I mean, this is every behavior, right, is influenced by evolutionary, cultural, and, economic/moral factors. On the evolutionary basis, I mean, obviously we kind of acquiring food has helped us pass down our genes. I think another one that seemed really compelling to me when I looked at, evolutionary reasons for behavior is this desire to display competence. And so the famous example is how the male bowerbirds building their nests, right? And they build these ceremonial ornate nests. And the whole purpose of the nest is then the female bowerbirds go around and look at the nest and decide who to mate with based on how much they like the nest. And then what's crazy is the female bowerbirds go and build a nest to raise the kids. So this whole first nest is just to show that the male bowerbird is effective at interacting with the world, right? That is able to display competence. And of course, that notion of displaying competence through, physical things has also been extended to displaying competence through the successful completion of tasks. And so if you think about our busy calendars and our kind of tendency to just go to meetings to make people happy and think that we're doing a good job, I mean, I think that there's that's an evolutionary behavior, this displaying competence and showing that we can effectively interact with the world. And that seems like it would tie really closely with a lot of the times that we add, because when you subtract, right, you're interacting with the world, but you're not necessarily showing other people that you're interacting with the world.
I really like the bowerbirds example, and I tend to fall into the more cynical camp when it comes to evolutionary psychology. Well, and I mean, obviously not evolution on its own, but in terms of kind of cherry picking examples and saying like, this must be because, evolution. But I think you're right. We see a lot of hoarding behavior in different cultures. And certainly what you said about it being this combination of factors, economic and social and so on. And sure, there's probably some sort of evolutionary underpinning there, but definitely not the whole story.
Evolution provides like a really cool metaphor too of how we might use these things, right? So adaptation is a addition and then selection is a subtraction. And, Gabe and I aren't anti-addition. We just want people to have all their options. And, so evolution kind of evolves through this combination of adding and subtraction. There are two complementary ways of making change. And sorry, Gabe, I interrupted. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I was just going to say, Leidy, we've talked about how people will come up to us and say, oh, well, I bet you that like in Japan or in Germany, or in the Netherlands, like a lot of people claim that actually like their culture would be, more inclined. People often say to us, oh, well, Americans, like a culture of excess, like that, of course, you have this bias against subtracting and a bias toward adding. So, yeah, I think that these are all really interesting questions. And then, of course, just less on a grand kind of evolutionary or cultural scale, there's also just the hypothesis that this is a kind of behavior that is learned and reinforced over time, that we get rewarded for adding we don't get rewarded for subtracting. And as Leidy has put it so eloquently, subtraction has a noticeability problem in that you can't see stuff that's been taken away, but you can see stuff that's added. And so we think about, how do I improve something? And we see that others have added things, and we say that things have had things added onto it or onto them. And so we learn maybe normatively that the acceptable thing to do when improving something is to add. So there's also that possible mechanism as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge one. I mean, we're walking around the world with all these reminders of addition, slapping us in the face, and the subtractions disappear into the ether.
So you talked about how we don't even think about subtraction, and we don't notice it when it does happen, but it's also pretty difficult to subtract, sometimes more difficult than adding. So in your example of the Legos, it might take the same amount of effort to take away a Lego as it would to put a Lego onto a tower. But there are other cases, I think, where it's actually harder to subtract. And you use some examples of this. One that comes to mind for me personally is with modern architecture. And so my dad is actually an architect, not a choice architect like some of us, but a real architect.
A real architect.
Yeah. So when we talk about choice architecture, he's just like rolling his eyes. So he's a real architect. He's a modern architect. And I personally went through a renovation of my house. A couple at this point, but we found that in order to get the builders to really achieve this goal of, perfect lines and minimalism, it took so much work and energy than it would have to just kind of cover it up with the trim. And I learned that there are all sorts of techniques that builders use to sort of cut corners and get away with this, basically not working as hard by adding rather than subtracting. So can you tell me more about about this counterintuitive aspect of getting to less by actually thinking more, doing more, and it being just a harder thing to do?
Yeah, I think that is so important because I think one of the reasons we don't subtract more and we don't get to less more is because we think it's easy, right? And there is this version of easy less where we just don't do anything, and that's fine. That's another option. People get mad at me when I say what I'm talking about is not bad. And it's like, it's fine to do nothing sometimes, but what we're talking about here is an action. And from the cognitive level, which is the research that we've done, it shows that it's not that we can't think of subtraction. It's that we think of adding first and then move on. So if you want to think of subtracting, it takes a little more effort. You have to think of the adding thing, which comes to mind right away. And then you have to think of subtraction. So it takes a little more cognitive effort there. And then as you move into the world, I mean, your example of modern architecture is beautiful. It's because this thing that looks simple and looks streamlined, first the architect had to think of, okay, here's the traditional way that we would do this. And now what are the things that we can strip away? So just as it's the same basic, more steps, right? So the thinking process, you think first of adding and then you think of subtracting. But then in the physical world, you have to kind of physically add these things, or at least think about physically adding them or draw them or whatever, and then say, okay, what can I take away? And most of the examples of improvement through subtraction come kind of post adding. And so it is more work. And I think we need to kind of recognize that and realize that and appreciate it when others do it. And also when we're trying to do it, if we think that it's going to be easy, we're never going to get there. So we need to know what we're in for. I mean, editing is another example, right? So you guys, when you just interrupted each other in that question there, you're going to have to edit that out, which is going to improve the podcast, but that's a subtraction. The easier, less work thing would be to leave it in there. And I'm sure you're going to edit out some of my rambling responses too. So
no one will ever know that you said that.
Exactly. It's a good, but it's a brilliant point that it is harder, the subtraction that we're talking about.
Yeah. And I think for me, with writing has been a big lesson that way, in terms of it's so much harder to write in brevity. And there's also some famous quotes on that. And also what I've learned to most appreciate is whenever I write something, talking about editing, is to have an editor who comes in and takes things away that's not needed there. And obviously it can be emotionally tough to let go of those things, because that was my favorite paragraph or like my favorite chapter. But it's really what makes good writing is usually that process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we all are taught this in school, but it's also hard to do it in practice. That was actually one of the studies that we did. So we asked people to write a summary paragraph of a newspaper article, and then we asked them to improve their own writing. And, when we did this, people still didn't subtract. So they still ended up with more words than they had started with when they're asked to improve this like very short summary paragraph. And then we also took their initial summaries and we gave them to someone else. And we said, hey, like, we know you didn't write this, but improve this. And even then, even when it wasn't their own writing, people still didn't subtract. They still added words to make the summary better.
They got a little better. When it was somebody else's, they got a little better. So it does like kind of speak to the help from an editor, but still, and that like a little bit of this learned behavior, right? I mean, Strunk and White is the most assigned book on high school and college syllabi, and their core advice is omit needless words. And so when we did that study, we were sitting there thinking, whoa, this one might not, show subtraction blindness because people should know this, right? And so it kind of, it's a little bit of evidence that even learning to subtract or even being told to subtract through our education isn't necessarily enough to kind of subtract this or remove this bias.
Knowing it is not enough. You have to think of it.
Yeah. Yeah. The big difference.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you got professional subtractors, if you recruited some editors to participate in your studies, if that would actually solve your problem.
The pandemic ruined that. We were going to send Andy to the professional editors conference. Seriously, we've had this conversation. Okay. Yeah. And see, and then also like coders will probably be emailing you all after this episode and saying, we do this, we subtract from our lines of code. But yeah, that's another really interesting line for the research. Also seeing if the editors are better at subtracting in other aspects of their lives. Like, are they really good at removing words? Yes. If their house is a disaster.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like with Ted Locke and his work on forecasting, he has super forecasters. So I'm curious if you're going to have your band of super subtractors.
Super tractors. Yeah.
Good one.
It would be interesting. I think, Leidy's question about, can people do this across all domains? What our research suggests is that people have to effortfully consider subtracting in a situation in order to do it. And it's hard for subtracting or like the reminder to subtract to be chronically accessible, right? It's one of those things that we know in our studies, if you make it momentarily accessible, then it prompts people to consider it and then hopefully to select it. But whether subtraction could be made chronically accessible or whether there are experts for whom subtraction is chronically accessible, I think that remains to be seen.
So in terms of making it practical, because I think we're getting into really that domain of like, how can we really put practice to this idea? And when it comes to teams, you mentioned, the importance of making that in some way, maybe some reminders or cues for subtraction. But is there anything you generally advise product teams, or if you're a behavioral scientist or a group of behavioral scientists that are trying to solve problems, what advice do you have for those kind of teams?
I mean, I'll build on what Gabe said about the reminders. And so the study is useful here, actually. So one of the ways that we tried to see whether people weren't even thinking of this was to give them reminders. And the reminder in the study was, hey, you can add or subtract. And, it's pretty intuitive that a reminder to subtract is going to make people subtract more. But what was really interesting from the study is that the adding didn't make people add more. So basically the adding reminder was redundant with what people were thinking, and the subtracting reminder brought new ideas to mind. And that was evidence for our studies that people weren't even thinking of this. Now, taking that into the world, it's like, how can you cue subtraction at the moment of choice, right? And I think that's something that after listening to this podcast episode, anybody could do. You say, okay, here's some times where I'm making important decisions. Maybe it's my planning my schedule for the week and I've got my to-dos, and while I'm considering my to-dos, I'm going to force myself to consider stop doing, so that you're reminding yourself to consider subtraction. You could imagine that working in a behavioral design team, for example, where it's like, okay, we're going to have our group meeting and we're going to think about what are the behaviors. We want to make sure that we consider the barriers to change, right? And removing barriers to change. And so give ourselves that reminder, which, Kurt Lewin's done a good job of helping people remember that. But it's, those are examples of putting reminders in place at the moment of decision. And I don't know what all the decision points are for every person, but I'm sure you could take a little bit of time and think about where it's important to consider subtraction and then put those reminders in place so that you don't overlook it next time you get to those decisions.
In Teams research, we talk about process checkers. So people who are responsible for keeping an eye on the processes in Teams and making sure that good process is being followed. And, process checkers tend to want to say, okay, well, here are the process we should follow. But one of the things that we could actually add is a reminder to subtract. So, asking process checkers to explicitly ask the question periodically, have we thought about things that we could take away? Have we considered what we might remove from the situation? So, making it kind of building it into meetings and into decision processes and into design processes could be one way to go. I mean, kind of taking a step back, your question about what could teams do? I think there's another question there, which is do we need big teams? Do we need teams at all? Do we need these meetings? Do we need to, is it really worth making sure that everyone comes in the office? And some things certainly do. There are a lot of decisions that are better with input. They're better with, involvement of others in the decisions. But I think we over meetingize our schedule, for lack of a better word. We have really crowded calendars and, just exploding diaries and just so much. Our time is just overbooked. So the other thing I would say, just with respect to teams, is let's get rid of some meetings if we can. Let's get rid of, stuff that's filling up our calendars that we could do much more efficiently over email or, through other media.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach because it actually uses subtraction as your strategy. Whereas when you're adding reminders to subtract, you're still adding something.
Yeah. And we've talked to some, doctors about this, and they're like, don't add another reminder. We have so many reminders that we just click through them all. And so they're saying, we need a different thing than just a cue in this case. Gabe also had a cool idea for team stuff, assuming you do need a team for the thing you're doing, to have kind of the same way you have a devil's advocate, somebody who just might, question everything that's happening in the meeting, and they're assigned to do that. You could also assign I forget Gabe's catchy name for it, but basically somebody whose job is to think about subtraction for that whole meeting. I'd also say subtracting first is useful here. And so there's this, I learned about it after writing the book, but there's this exercise called start, stop, continue that businesses will do. And it's ordered the wrong way, right? So if you're thinking about stuff you're going to start before thinking about stuff you're going to stop, you want to strip away before you think about what you can add. And so anyway, getting the sequencing right is important. I think thinking about subtracting first is a surefire way to not overlook it. And it just makes logistical sense because then you're starting from the clean slate. You've removed the wasteful stuff before you start adding things.
Your next book could be Stop, Start, Continue.
Stop, Start, Continue. Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about different ways of subtracting in our kind of everyday decisions, right? Subtracting meetings and Legos and so on. But there are some examples of really meaningful subtraction. So when it comes to innovation, right? And you talk about the K brick, which is, I think, a really great example where structural integrity of a brick was improved by subtracting material from the brick. And then another example like this is the Strider bike, which toddlers have now been using for a few years, where pedals were subtracted as a means of improving the bike as opposed to adding training wheels. And so I'm curious whether the two of you have, since you have subtraction on your mind all the time, if you've come up with your own kind of innovations, if you've sort of, I don't know, deliberated on this topic. If you weren't spending your time in other ways, what would you invent through subtraction?
Levy, shall I tell the Nobel story?
Yeah,
You think? I mean,
definitely.
that's the one that, so when we were doing this research, of course, as academics, we're always thinking about, we just have lots of, really packed schedules. So service and teaching and research and all of the other stuff that goes into our jobs. And we were feeling, super stressed, and we were making New Year's resolutions. This was like, back in, I think, 2019. And, we came up with this idea of, not could we make a to-do list, but how could we make a list of things that we should stop doing or that we should not do anymore? And, we were talking at the beginning of this conversation about the pandemic and things that we would like to maintain. And for me, I was talking about, prioritizing time. And that's been an insight, like a personal insight from this research, is to be more protective of my time, but also to think about what are things that I currently do that I should stop doing or that I should not do anymore. And then Leidy, as kind of a brilliant idea and a running joke, got us this bell that we could ring, and we affectionately call it our no bell. And it's our bell that we ring when we say no to doing something that we've been asked to do, or it's when we say no to something that we shouldn't be doing anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that works on this idea of competence too that we talked about, right? So now they're making their subtractions visible and kind of displaying competence by not doing something. So yeah, I think that's a good example. I haven't come up with any brilliant like engineering inventions, but I have used it more with my parenting and remembering to remove barriers. So like with my well, now it's both kids watching the iPad, and I can fight with them and offer incentives. Not fight, that's a bad word. No, like they I can say, okay, here, take a cookie. If you turn off the shows, you can have a cookie, and that might work. But it's a classic example of just introducing tension in the system, right? You're adding this other force that's working against the force of them wanting to watch TV. And so now, thinking about this research, I'll often just like move the iPad out of the way and some where they don't see it. And so it's like you've removed this temptation. And I mean, our 6-year-old tends to think, okay, where's the iPad? But it still works sometimes on him where it's like, okay, now it's out of sight, out of mind, and I've removed the barrier and don't even have to offer a cookie, and it just makes everything go more smoothly. So that's the level of innovation I'm at right now. Maybe when they go to college, I'll be able to invent something as cool as the K-Brick or the Strider bike. These are like truly world-changing innovations. Dad's going to be proud of you, Aline. You're talking about all this architecture stuff on the podcast.
No, he's still rolling his eyes.
I mean, one of the insights too for me in doing this research with Leidy and Ben and Andy was just that ultimately improvement problems, change problems are all about design, right? And oh my God, Leidy, who's the name of the guy who said everyone designs, who changes something?
Oh, that was Herbert Simon said that.
Herbert Simon, right.
So
okay.
Yeah, it was post Nobel Prize. It was his like the latter half of his career. He got really interested in design stuff, and he saw it as this unifying pursuit that unified all the professions. Right? It's like you're trying to change things from how they are to how you want them to be, and this is arguably the most fundamental decision in that unifying pursuit. When we're changing things from how they are to how we want them to be, what do we think of first? So yeah, I think the tie into design is really important here. And I think that's one reason we were so excited to come on this podcast, because it's behavioral design, right? I mean, you've got that right in the name. And I think so often we're thinking about behavioral science, and then the design piece is like, okay, how are we moving this science into how we can actually affect change with it? And so, yeah, we find our work situated right there.
Yeah. And so, there's two kinds of designs here that we're talking about. One is how we can design, situations for people to encourage them to subtract. But also, the other point is that everyone designs, and that when they design, we're just trying to help them think about subtraction as an option. When I say that everyone designs, what we mean is that like you are designing if you're trying to think about how to make a product better, how to make an idea better, how to make a situation better. You're designing as a parent when you try to figure out like the best, carpool schedule. You're designing as an academic when you create a syllabus and you list the readings for your students. And so if you think about it, people confront design problems every day, many, many times a day. Almost every problem that people are tasked with solving, almost every task or job that people do is fundamentally, in some ways, a design problem because we're trying to improve something, trying to make it better. And so there, the point of our research is that if you could think about your design problem as an opportunity for subtraction, not just as an opportunity for addition, that's what we're really trying to get people to think about. And that's what we wanted to think about in this research.
I love that. Here. That's really,
Yay.
Yeah, awesome. I'm going to now take us a little bit on a detour into kind of a recurring segment, which is a quick fire round we like to call underrated versus overrated. And so pretty much what we'll do is we'll list a couple of things and ask you whether you think it's, underrated or overrated. And you can add a little bit quick note on maybe why, but we try to keep this a little more high tempo than the rest of the show, so to say. So with that being said, are you guys ready? Legos.
Underrated.
Underrated. Yeah. There's no way they could be overrated.
They're amazing. Those things are incredible, man. And they can keep your kids occupied for hours.
Yeah. And during the pandemic, I was making calculations like, okay, a $200 Lego set, that is 10 hours of Ezra's time. That's my son. Then, a babysitter costs $200 too. So I'll go with the Lego set because babysitters might have been exposed to COVID. Yeah. Underrated. No question.
Loss aversion.
Properly rated. I think all the attention it gets is deserved. And it's awesome to see that kind of the second wave of loss aversion research. Like as an engineer or being trained in engineering, it really is funny to me when people are like, oh, loss aversion didn't perfectly replicate in this other situation. It's like, well, yeah, neither does gravity replicate if a feather's falling from the air because there's air resistance, right? It's like none of these principles are universal, independent of context. And so loss aversion properly rated, keep paying attention to it. And also keep paying attention to the research that shows how it, in my mind, I think the research that's happening now is the equivalent of people figuring out friction and some of these second tier physics and chemistry concepts.
I think underrated, although I think there's poor inter-rater reliability. I think it depends on if you ask a behavioral economist versus a social psychologist. But yeah, it's just such a ubiquitous phenomenon. And, we can get into a debate about whether it's, it's behavioral econ or social psych or behavioral science or whatever. But it's such a powerful thing. And it's so fundamental. And I think it really did change the way that people thought about, not just a field of research, but about the world. Yeah.
Beautiful.
So this one is probably going to notice is more tailored to for one of you. Soccer as a metaphor for sustainability.
Properly rated. It's that was my first book. And the reason I tied soccer into sustainability is because, soccer and sustainability are very, they're complex systems. And so it was a fun metaphor for describing sustainability. And then the selfish reason was that I like soccer, read a lot about soccer and played soccer a lot. So properly rated. I'm interested what Gabe has to say, though.
I mean, I think it's underrated. My first advice would be to buy subtraction. My second piece of advice would be to buy soccer through sustainability. I grew up in a soccer playing family as well. My brother played, I played. My kids are just starting to play. It's a beautiful game. It's the beautiful game.
Yes.
And I think the real debate worth having is whether it's soccer or football.
Football,
yeah.
But,
Wow. Basketball all the way. Sorry. It's basketball.
Oh, I meant football as a name for soccer.
Oh.
Exactly, yeah.
Wow. Subtracting that line.
Well, I should actually not have said football because it was confusing in American context.
No, I appreciate you standing up for the real name of the sport. Anyway, Aline?
Showing your work.
Like open science?
No.
No. Overrated.
You have to do a math problem and you have to show how you got to the answer.
Totally overrated. I think like showing your work, taking notes. I certainly there's some value to it. And I think, the first time you do a math problem and your teacher wants to see how you did it, then fine. But in terms of, this is so much of that falls into, I'm displaying competence by showing all this useless stuff I did, not useless, but, useless to the audience. So you need to kind of strip it away and just show people what the answer is. I mean, arguably the only time showing your work is valuable is in this like kind of educational setting. And again, I'm not anti-open science. That's another one where it's like, but you're in open science, you're putting the work out there and you're doing the really hard subtractive work of writing the conclusions and the main points in the paper so that everybody doesn't have to go through the 10,000 hours of research that you did to get to the same conclusion.
Underrated. One word answer.
Coba.
Underrated. So Coba is a Mayan ruin on the Yucatan Peninsula. It's like an hour away from Cancun and Cozumel. And it's just astonishing because here's this thing that was built a really long time ago and you can just walk up to it. And, if this was in the United States, it would be totally gated off and you'd have to observe it from afar. But you can walk around it. It's a like it's a national park, and you can play on these. They have a huge pyramid, and then they also have a like the ball courts that they used to play on. So tying it back to football, like this is some of the early days of the evolution of soccer, and you can just like go on these very same courts that the people went on way back then. So underrated. You should definitely check it out. And it's in the book because it's an example of this monumental architecture, which is a very additive behavior being there at the genesis of pretty much every civilization.
I do know what it is, but I had been pronouncing it in my head wrong the entire time. When you like see a word, it's not how you have ever heard it. So that's yes. Cannot comment, but I will say that I think Stonehenge is overrated.
Nice. So obviously a little bit of a theme has been that we need to be reminded of the idea of subtraction. And we realized that there's so many quotes to the idea of like less is more, right? Like everyone has heard the idea of less is more. And then we started nerding out about finding quotes on that topic, and we found so many good quotes. So we wanted to get your help and figuring out like, okay, which best represents the concept and are like keepers for being reminded of subtraction. So we're going to through like a quicker version of the quickfire round within this and just go through some quotes. So the first one, the more you know, the less you need.
Yeah, I buy that.
And I also like that one because, we haven't talked much about ideas, but that's one of the things that we studied in the paper was, objects, situations, and ideas. And, as we're thinking about how we're modifying and changing and designing our ideas, subtraction is an option there too.
How about, if I had more time, I would have written you a shorter letter.
I love that one. And it's, it gets credited to Mark Twain, but if you do the deep dive, like it sounds like you have it, there's no actual record of him saying it, but there's a record of like Pascal said it, Ben Franklin said it. And
everyone said it.
Yeah, everyone said it.
Yeah, although I don't know if subtraction is more effort. You just have to remember to do it.
I'm actually now hesitant to say that this is an Albert Einstein quote because everything is attributed to Einstein, but make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler.
I like that.
Yeah, I also like, that hints at this process, right? It's like make it as simple as possible means that it's not like come up with a simple idea. There's an action that he's implying in that quote that's attributed to him that you need to make it. You need to make it simple, which implies that you're stripping away the complexity, like Annaline's addition.
How about perfection is achieved not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away.
Yeah, I think that's great. Leidy and I have talked about this quote before, for sure.
Yeah, good one.
Okay, we'll stick in Herbert Simon as well, given that we mentioned him. A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention.
For sure.
Yeah, and awesome. And that was... he was writing in an era of like Xerox machines. I forget, it's in the book, but I kind of like have another quote from that same paragraph where he's talking about humans' brains being completely maladapted to Xerox machines. And, so obviously as we get into this world of Twitter, we're facing that same kind of challenge.
Okay, one final quote for you. The best way to find out what we really need is to get rid of what we don't.
Is that Marie Kondo?
It is.
Whoa, good job.
Well done.
My Kondo scholarship is paying off. Her stuff's really obvious. She's not pretending that it's coming from this place of science, but it's really wise advice. And if you look at how she, what she's doing there, whether intentionally or not, is kind of steering us around loss aversion a little bit, right? So that one of the ways that loss aversion could prevent subtraction is if you only think of subtraction, if you're confusing taking away with always being a loss. And, so she's helping with that in that quote.
Amazing. Well done. You guys, did a really good job going through the round. And the last question for this season, we have decided that it's going to be focused on changing your mind. So what is one thing that each of you have changed your mind about?
Gabe's thinking, it looks like. So I will go first. I think one thing that is about this, and I think it's more of like a shift on a continuum, but it's a pretty big change, is that this notion of everybody being able to kind of like chart their own path in the United States and a level playing field. And I think that I never thought that the playing field was perfectly level, but I had this idea that, if you just worked hard and, paid attention in school, you could make it. And I think, partly that's been world events with, Black people being 3 times as likely to get COVID, for example, but also just with a kid, right? When I take my 6-year-old to school and then see some of the other 6-year-olds getting dropped off and, thinking about their home lives and where they're starting from, it's totally not a level playing field. So, so that's shifted more from this kind of individuals are responsible for their own success, which of course that's part of it. I don't want to downplay the individual component of it, but also like the systemic things that we can try to address that to help everybody have like this equal opportunity that we like to promise people here in the United States. So.
Wow. Yeah. Down with the American dream.
It's not down. Yeah. It's just
Swedish dream. Yay.
Yeah. The Swedish dream. Yeah.
Gabe, what about you?
At risk of sounding less profound than Leidy, which is something I am always at risk of, I have recently changed my mind about jeggings. I used to be very anti-jeggings, and I just bought my first pair of jeggings, and oh my God, it's a game changer. Buy yourself a pair of jeggings. Men, women, children, go for it. You will never look back.
I don't know what that is. Should I know what that is? Yes.
Oh my God. Leidy, do you know what jeggings are?
It's a portmanteau, Samuel. It's like satisficing. So jeans and leggings, right? Is that one? Yeah.
Yes.
Wayne, do you have jeggings? Have you ever worn
of course
jeggings?
I do. Oh yeah. I invented the jeggings.
I invented.
Yeah, they're the best.
She was an early adopter.
I really
I'm supposed to be a laggard. I must be a laggard in this scenario. Yeah.
I mean, I can't believe it took me so long, and it was a pandemic discovery when all I was doing was wearing leggings, and I was like, well, I should at least pretend that they're jeans. So I bought jeggings.
I would say that my fashion in the pandemic has really devolved much farther than that. I would say that I used to think leggings were comfortable. Now, like I used to think jeans were comfortable. Now I can only really wear pajama pants. It's like all I can do now.
But Leidy, when I was like deep in thought about like something I had changed my mind about, I was like, you were thinking like, oh, the American dream, and I'm thinking jeggings. So clearly there's a bit
I
of a
think
contrast.
it's great. It's like a very practical thing and a very lofty thing that I can't actually do anything about, but at least I thought about it, right?
You could buy some jeggings though.
Yeah,
it's one thing you could do.
Yeah, I love both answers. And I really love this conversation. It was so much fun to have you both here. I obviously can't encourage everyone listening enough to check out the book. And also we're going to reference the research paper and so on. I think it's really, for people listening, working in some ways with behavioral design, I think it's such a, in some ways, profound thing when it comes to really understanding the importance of it. Because after having done, a decade of behavioral design work in practice, I notice every day that probably the most effective thing I can do is to remove friction. It's not adding a lot of bells and whistles, but often finding ways to kind of remove barriers or like removing friction. So it's a really, really important design principle as well. So I'm really happy that we could kind of spend an hour talking about all aspects of it. And yeah, thank you guys for your amazing work.
Of course.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, this was really fun. I appreciate the work you guys are doing to kind of share these ideas through your podcast, ours and others. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much. It was really fun getting a chance to meet both of you. And I always love chatting with Leidy. It's always a highlight of my day. So thanks for the opportunity to do that like publicly. Always fun.
You got to bring you on all my podcasts, Gabe.
so that I can talk about jeggings and
yeah,
and forget
that's what they're here for.
Thanks for listening to the Behavioral Design Podcast from Habit Weekly and the Center for Advanced Hindsight at Duke University. Make sure to subscribe to the show. And if you like what we're doing here, don't forget to share it with a friend or colleague. Our fantastic show music is Murgatroyd by the wonderful Dave Pizarro. And big thanks to the team at Orange Wall Media for the production of this episode. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another deep dive into all things behavioral design.
Heavens to Murgatroyd.
Oh, Blow.
Now I can only really wear pajama pants. It's like all I can do now.